Tonight we've got a fantastic and very topical topic of the Green New Deal, and the question, is it the answer? And I suppose we've posed it like that because obviously it has become the thing from being almost nowhere, no one heard of it. Suddenly it's what XR, what the climate strikers and so on are demanding. So I think it's worth examining what it really means, what its history is it enough to address the significant challenges that we face. And this evening we've got a fantastic panel to help us do that. First we've got Anne Pettifor, who was one of the original team who created the idea of the Green New Deal back in 2008 to 2009, and she will be telling you more about this. She's a woman of many parts. She led the Jubilee debt campaign in up to the noughties. Before that she was in the GLA at crucial moments and much else besides. She's a trustee of promoting economic pluralism. She also is part of the Progressive Economic Forum and has been a leading light in pushing different ways of thinking about macroeconomics for some time, with many very good books. And we go to Nick Mabey next, and I'll come back to Nick Mabey. I've known for we actually were partners in crime in the noughties, trying to also fight for different ways of thinking about economics in the sort of sustainable development space. That was when he was working in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, which was the very cool place to be working in government in those days, when governments had strategy and things like that. Those days. He is now Chief Executive, Managing Director, or something? Chief Executive, okay, of E3G, third generation environmental NGO, which is leading the way internationally, campaigning around climate change and much else, and is part of the London, as a sort of partner in this week's London Climate Change Week, which I don't know if people are aware of it or been part of that, but this event is actually part of a whole series of events, much of which have already happened, so it's probably too late to tell you because we're towards the end of the week. But hopefully you've caught up on that. Last but not least, I come to Becky Rosen. I first worked with Becky in Willis. Why did I say Rosen? Because I have another friend called Rosen. I introduced it. He does. I have a good friend called Becky Rosen. I suddenly got Becky Willis, who I first worked with in 2002 at the Green Alliance, trying to persuade the Treasury to do something different with VAT. We didn't succeed, did we?
No, we didn't.
You've forgotten that. It's, what's it emblazoned on my memory. But she led the Green Alliance for a long time. She was also Vice Chairman of the Sustainable Development Commission and has many and diverse roles, as well as being an academic who's done some major work recently exploring how MPs deal with the question of climate change as a politician. So she's very well placed to comment on how the Green New Deal fits in from that perspective. So we're doing a sort of panel format, starting with Anne, then Becky, and then Nick, sort of 5 to 10 minutes, and to sort of set the scene, if you like, and then we will open up to a sort of quick Q&A discussion. Following, and I'll try to keep some sort of order and see how it'll sort of work, so we have a bit of sort of coherence and have a sort of conversation rather than lots of questions jumping all around the place, which sometimes can happen. So, Anne.
Right. Hi. So thank you very much. It's really good to be here and to see this many people here on a hot, steamy night. So well done, and thank you very much for all coming. I've only got 5 or 10 minutes, so I don't know what I can say meaningfully in that time, but because I've just written the book, The Case for the Green New Deal, and I do hope you'll buy it when it's published.
You'll have lots of time to expand again across the question.
So therefore I won't expand tonight. But I want to say this, that we're facing a really grave crisis, and it's not just a crisis of climate breakdown, it's a crisis of Earth systems breakdown. And therefore the things upon which we rely for sustaining life on Earth are at a point where they may break down and therefore not make life sustainable. It is really more urgent than I think anyone has any real clear idea, anyone in government at least has a clear idea about. Then the question becomes, what can we do about this? And what I'd like to argue is that we can't do anything about it for this reason, which is that policy making and decision making requires boundaries, as Herman Daly once explained very clearly. You require boundaries. If you're going to have regulation, you've got to decide what are the boundaries of that regulation. Who's included in being regulated? If you want to provide pensions, or you want to tax your citizens or your corporations, there are boundaries for taxation. For all policy requires boundaries. The financial system, money, hates boundaries. And the way the financial system has evolved, the way the global economy has evolved, is that markets are now, if you like, in the words of Quinn Slobodian, who's written a wonderful book called The Globalists, he's an academic at Harvard, markets are now encased out in the stratosphere, effectively, away from government, away from any possibility of government intervention. That's their purpose. That's the purpose of the way in which the global economy is being restructured. It's to protect markets from interference, especially by democratic governments. And that's been the neoliberal theory since the 1930s, when they called themselves the globalists, back Hayek and Mises and so on. Their idea was to protect markets from interference by governments. So we now have what Alan Greenspan said not very long ago. He said, thanks to globalization, policy decisions in the United States have been largely replaced by global market forces. National security aside, he said, it hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. The world is governed by market forces. Right? And that's so. And then I have a wonderful quote here from the World Trade Organization, in which they argue that the experience of the World Trade Organization and the way it works via binding commitments reached by consensus gives some guidance as to how these systemic gaps can be bridged. And the systemic gaps they're speaking of is this. The central government challenge that we face in a new global age is this. The fact that governments answer mainly to national constituencies. They think that's the problem. While increasingly the economic system must, say the World Trade Organization, must answer to something they call global needs. They don't say whose needs, they call them global needs. And we know very well who they're talking about, right? So they then act as a body to sort of kind of fill the gap between governments that will insist on paying attention to their national constituencies, when actually what they should be doing is they should be paying attention to global needs. This is the World Trade Organization. So we have a really big problem. If we want to make policy to transform our economy in order to protect our ecosystem, we're going to have to do something about a globalized financial system that is beyond the reach of governments, but at the same time governs all relatively important economic policy. And that is, the exchange rate, it's the rate of interest across the spectrum, because the central bank's fixing of interest rates is very limited, it applies to only a limited number of organizations. The availability of finance, the ability of governments to spend. All of these are curtailed and overseen and managed and governed, as Greenspan argues correctly, by market forces. And market forces ain't going to be too excited about diverting resources away from highly profitable corporations, including oil companies and coal companies, but mainly oil companies and gas companies. Right? So we've got a really big problem here. And the reason why I'm a great supporter of the Green New Deal is that much of the history of the New Deal is really profoundly misunderstood, and I don't think that is an accident. Because the really truly radical and even revolutionary thing that Roosevelt did was in terms of monetary policy. On the night of his inauguration, the Saturday night of his inauguration, he dismantled the international gold standard. The Brits had come off the gold standard in 1931, but on the 3rd of March 1933, he announced that the United States was coming off the gold standard overnight. And he wanted the banks to hand over their gold to the Fed on the Sunday morning. And his staff said to him, "You can't do it, it's a holy day. You've got to wait till Monday." So much of what is talked about in relation to Roosevelt is that he fixed the banks. But he only fixed the banks because he took away from them the power and the authority they gained by the establishment of Ricardo's gold standard, basically. And I won't go into the gold standard here, but the gold standard is basically a system, again, which allows market forces, global market forces, to govern the economy. And that was what prevailed before 1914, and that was what was restored in 1918. And the really heroic thing that Roosevelt did overnight, and that is why I think we can transform the economy overnight, because we've done it before. And then, of course, again in 1971, Nixon overnight dismantles the Bretton Woods system. So we know these things are possible. But overnight he transformed the international financial system, and he subordinated Wall Street to the democratic interests of the American people. And at that point, unemployment in the United States was 25%. And they had a massive, massive environmental crisis. It was called the Dust Bowl, and it had to be addressed. Right? They had these enormous movements, migration of people, and of course disruption of agriculture because they had treated the land badly and that they had a big problem. But to finance the transformation of the Dust Bowl and to transform the economy so that the 25% unemployed could get jobs would require state action. And that would not have been possible if Wall Street was in the driving seat and not the government. And so he effectively strips Wall Street of their role of calling the shots in the economy. And he begins to take control in particular of the value of the dollar, the exchange rate, and then of course eventually come capital controls and other things. But the fact is that he had to do that first. Now his work and his achievement is often described as, and so is Keynes, and one of my reasons for being so angry about the history of this is that Keynes is often depicted as a tax and spender. And fiscal policy was deeply uninteresting to Keynes. He didn't think you should ever have to use fiscal policy. He thought fiscal policy, if you had to resort to fiscal policy to fix your economy, you were in deep trouble. It was 1929, and you had to fix the big hole that had been created by the financial system. But he'd much rather have the actual financial and the monetary system managed and fixed and made stable and made such that it made the financing of big projects like creating jobs and tackling the Dust Bowl possible. He said that's the thing to do. When you do that, and in particular when you create jobs, you generate the income that's needed to repay government spending, and it keeps the economy, if you like, in stable. So as we all know from our own experience, when we get a job, at the end of the month we're paid. So it's a consequence. Our income is a consequence of our employment. And furthermore, we then pay taxes. So for governments, employments generate income. One of the reasons we've had such a very, very weak recovery is that we've had low levels of really good, skilled, well-paid employment since the crisis. There's no accident. This is a structural change that the markets are really happy to see happen. But as a result, government isn't collecting the revenues that it would collect from an employed population engaged in skilled work and paid and remunerated decently. So really what what Ristfeld was about how to fix the monetary system in order then to be able to fix that part of the ecosystem that had caused such a crisis, but also to create jobs. As far as I'm concerned, a green economy is going to have to be an employment-rich economy. It's going to have to be a job-rich economy. This morning I was at a meeting with the New Economics Foundation on a just transition, and we had all the stuff that Silicon Valley is throwing at us. It's so extraordinary. Oh, we're going to have AI, we're going to have robots. What are we going to do about all those people that are going to be unemployed? Well, why don't we think up a UBI? Why don't we think up ways of doling out money to the poor unemployed, right? And we're all folding our hands and saying, oh God, that's all coming. What are we going to do? How are we going to cope? How do we adjust? What economic policies do we need to make that happen? But that's cloud cuckoo land, right? It's cloud cuckoo land to think that you can, for example, go on making iPhones ad infinitum. That something called the rare earths are not rare, right? Because these iPhones don't operate without the extraction of really valuable assets from some of the poorest countries in the world, in particular the DRC. Not poor, but the people, with the poorest people in the world. So this idea, this delusion, that we're going to have Earth systems break down, but that simultaneously Silicon Valley is going to turn the whole world into artificial intelligence and robots, and we're all going to have to sit there passively waiting for it to happen to us. This is deep, deep delusionalism, right? So we're going to have to transform our economy. In my view, and this is what I argue in the book, we're going to have to learn to be more self-sufficient. We're going to not be able to sit here and order carnations from Kenya and I don't know, paper clips from somewhere else and have them flown over to us at our convenience and, at any time. We're not going to be able to have these long supply chains that the supermarkets talk about. We're going to have to do a lot of walking, and we're going to have to do a lot of cycling. We're going to have to just get over the fact that we're not going to be able to fly. These are things that we're going to have to face. This is what Silicon Valley should be talking about, all those smart people in Silicon Valley. This is going to be the reality, because we cannot afford to burn fuel, we cannot afford to further, pollute our atmosphere. We've already packed it full of heating, which is melting systems and causing Earth systems breakdown. So if we really think this thing is as urgent as I believe it is, we're going to have to get hold of the levers, the economic levers that enable us to transform our economy. And we cannot do that as long as the globalized financial system is governing our economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm going to have a slightly different focus and talk about the Green New Deal as a political project. And I want to start in true academic style by not quite answering the question. Is the Green New Deal the answer? My non-answer to that is we, and by that I mean probably everyone in this room, are the wrong people to ask. Because the funny thing about what, like Henry, we've worked many years on climate policy, and one thing that I've noticed about the whole climate debate is that there's this illusion which the social scientist Martin Hager calls cockpitism. So cockpitism is this idea that you can steer the Earth or the climate system as if you were a pilot in a plane, maybe two pilots, almost certainly white male pilots, by the way, but you're in this plane. And you can decide, you have the levers and the dials and the information in front of you, and you can decide what to do with that plane, right? And that is how people implicitly think. The word we is used a lot, what we need to do about climate, or you use the passive voice to get around the fact that no one knows who the pilots are. It's not only that the climate system is a lot more complicated than a plane, it's actually that, who is in control and what gives them the right to be in control. And we don't talk about that. There are answers to that, but we don't talk about that nearly enough because we're too obsessed with, what that lever might be or what that dial might be and how to fly the plane. So, you know, the dialogue tends to be top-down, it tends to be undifferentiated, it tends to be apolitical. And that sort of observation had been troubling me for quite a long time, and it's one of the reasons why a few years ago I started a project looking at political responses to climate change, where I just thought I would go and talk to MPs about this dilemma. Because there's a lot of talk about, you know, if only politicians would, if only there was political will, we could crack all this. So I thought, well, what does it look like for them? What is the lived experience of being a politician trying to make decisions in this space? So I set off to do that, and I'm going to give you 3 very strong messages that came out of that research, and then say what I think that means for the Green New Deal. So the first very strong finding, and this won't be a surprise to you, is just the issue of the enormity of climate change. So there's one moment that I remember very distinctly when I was sitting with an MP in a cafe in the House of Commons, right next to the Thames, and he said to me, you know, I asked him how worried he was, basically, and he said, well, you know, where we're sitting now, this might be underwater. And it was one of those moments which, you know, really gets you in the gut. I mean, I'm sure, well, show of hands, who's had those sort of gut moments on climate? Yeah. And, you know, there was quite an atmosphere, and I let it run, but then he was away again and started talking about, I don't know, the difficulties of, you know, getting whatever policy through, or how hard it was to bring his party on side, all that kind of thing, and he was back in the everyday. And I thought after that, how do we sustain that moment? How do we sustain that moment of, this is a really serious thing? But it's very difficult for politicians to build that into their working life. And I had a lot of pushback. The more I went through my interviews, the more I tried to really get them to stay with that moment. And they all found ways of avoiding it, of getting back to day-to-day stuff. And I found that really telling. And if my research failed in any way, it's that I didn't manage to dwell there, despite trying. So the second problem is a sort of classic sociological one, really, and it's about identity. One thing that came across really strongly is that MPs who sort of saw themselves as climate champions had paid a price for that. So one of them said, I'm known as a freak, right? Direct quote, I'm known as a freak. And they had made a choice to construct their identity around being an outsider, being a crusader, being someone who really fights for something. And they had made that choice, often because they were so motivated by climate change that they couldn't keep quiet about it. They had to talk about it all the time. They'd made that choice, and it positioned them on the outside of their party. Now, some of these interviews were 2 years ago. You would have hoped that things had improved since then, given the amazing things that we're seeing. But I've talked to MPs since, and they, you know, one came up to me who'd been on a panel with me after this talk and was like, yeah, I'm one of those freaks. So when you're a politician, that sense of identity is really important. You know, politics is all about identity, as we are learning to our cost. And whether or not you're willing to go out on a limb for an issue like climate, or there are other issues which are, you know, freak issues, you have to make that choice. And I don't want you to judge people who don't make the choice to be a freak, because we'd all agree that, you know, you need mainstream politicians championing this stuff, and some MPs who were just as committed had decided that their best route was actually to sort of like calm it down a little bit, and, you know, maybe talk about co-benefits, or to try and sort of squeeze it in when they could, but not go out on a limb for it. And I sort of respected that as a strategy. Or no, I respect that as a tactic. Maybe not as a strategy, but as a tactic, definitely. You know, they're more likely to get into the cabinet, they're more likely to pull on the famous levers of power if they've been a little bit careful about how they're positioning themselves on the way through. And thirdly, the first two things are true to all of us, right? The kind of enormity point and the identity point. And the third one is perhaps more specific to politicians, and that's around the notion of representation. So politicians are elected to represent people, that's their job. What representation means, actually, no one's ever decided. We've been arguing since the ancient Greeks, and we've never concluded. But as I was talking to one MP who again was, really keen to push climate change, he said, well, look, I know who talks to me about climate change. I have people who come to my surgeries and they write to me, and I know very well what their views are. But they tend to be essentially middle class and rich. Meanwhile, there are 80,000 other people in my constituency who don't come and talk to me about it. And so you could see that he was weighing up his job as a representative. He was weighing up which groups he was representing and why, and what MPs think about climate change depends on this concept of representation. So of course you can make the claim as a politician that you are representing, in the what I would call a sort of cosmopolitan claim, that you are, a representative of the earth, the country, everybody, all species. That is one way of doing a representative claim. But it's a very brave MP who does that, and the ones who aren't so sure of themselves, and especially new MPs or MPs in marginal seats, will go straight back to, I represent the people of Wolverhampton. And again, that representation is a really, really strong issue for politicians. And those 3 points, the enormity, the identity question, and the representation question, cockpitism doesn't deal with any of those. Right, cockpitism just assumes that it's not about values and it's not about who you represent. It's just we're going to find the most efficient solution, and that's that is very clearly not how politicians think. So, to return to the Green New Deal, to what extent does the Green New Deal answer the challenge that I've posed it, if you like, the challenge of cockpitism? I think, and I'm mostly now referring to, and if you haven't read the text of AOC's Green New Deal resolution, please do, because it's an incredible political document. It's like kind of jaw-dropping in its audacity, and that's my sort of starting point. So, on the enormity question, I think it does that, right? It does that. It's kind of, it's a this is a crisis sort of a framing. It says, as Anne was suggesting, that this is a break point, that this is, a moment. Does it work on identity? Well, this is a really interesting one, because the Green New Deal in the US recently was explicitly an agenda of the outsiders. So AOC, her whole pitch is, I am an outsider, and she has used the Green New Deal to polish up that image of being an outsider. But the interesting thing is now, and what's going on with the debates within the Democratic Party, is that they've shifted the window, that they've actually managed to get it on the agenda of what you might call the mainstream Democratic Party, at least, and even making inroads into the right. So, identity, possibly, that we can see that shifting. We can see now that you can be a credible politician and say really radical things about climate. And then representation, well, to my mind, this is the biggest question, and I think the jury's out here. So what is brilliant about the Green New Deal proposals, which was very much part of Anne and team's plans 10 years previously as well, is that it's absolutely about people in place, and it's about jobs, and it's about people who are, people who have not been served well by the global economy. And it's the kind of answer that the left have not been able to answer for a long time, which maybe explains some of the success of the right, both in Europe and the US. But I would say, and I would remind you that, roughly half our population is right wing. That's not a judgment, that's a fact. I don't know what it is in the States, but these values do not appeal to everyone. And the space that I haven't seen, and I challenge, please tell me if you have seen that, is an equally radical sort of system-changing political economic vision coming from the right. And to my mind, this is a big hole, and I want to see that. It's not my politics, but I want to see it. And I want to see these two huge competing visions talking to each other, and I want to see how the right vision would respond to Anne's very justified criticisms around the flows of global finance. And I just haven't seen that yet. So I think that if a Green New Deal is to succeed, and particularly if it is to answer the challenge of the, what Anne called the globalists, it absolutely needs to be that political project which remembers that you need to get people behind you, you need movements behind you, you need votes behind you, you need to look at this in terms of people's lives and values and outlooks. So I will end by answering the question. I said we're the wrong people to ask. Do the people that matter, the 70 million in this country, the 200 million in the States, do they think the Green New Deal is the answer? Well, I think for the reasons I've outlined, I would say it shows promise as an answer, and it's probably the best we've seen to date. And the best thing about it is that it does give a realistic account of how you can build support and build a movement. It's not going to appeal to everybody. I would be very interested, as I said, in what other political traditions would have in answer to the systemic crisis that we face. But when you read the Green New Deal resolution, it's impossible to feel anything but an upswelling of hope, and that is what we really need at the moment.
Right, thanks. It really took me back to discussions in Bermondsey restaurants. Before Bermondsey was cool, we were. Bermondsey was a small group of economists we put together in the 90s even. Welcome to London Climate Action Week, everybody. You're in the first London Climate Action Week. 150 events, 200 events across London. You might not know it, but 250,000 people work in London on green issues. That certainly wasn't true when we were meeting in the 90s. So, things change, things move on, but some things don't change. Politics is one of those things that goes wrong. If you want to find out the reality of being a politician who supports climate change, go to Sadiq Khan's Twitter account, look for his tweet about the London Climate Action Week, this positive, job-creating, London's Global London inclusive festival of love and gorgeousness, and look at the comments. He's not getting a lot of love. That's what it feels like to be. It's basically you virtual signalling, why aren't you talking about knife crime? So that's what it feels like to be a politician when you feel you're pushing something out. So I think it's a good thing for anybody to do, to think about what it feels like to do this as a living, to make decisions, as opposed to advising or commenting to other people. So that's what we do. We work as a non-profit. I was asked to look at the international context, and I'm going to look at the international context of some of the places thinking about a Green New Deal, big investment programme, jobs, place, other pieces in a big concerted effort to solve the ecological emergency. But also talk about some of the lessons we're learning from other spaces and perhaps how transferable they are to a UK context as we are here in the UK. So it's really a transatlantic phenomenon. So we have, of course, the US at state and federal level, where we have a few different Green New Deals in play at different places, mainly from the left, so it's very identified with the left. The right, and I'll get to some of the polling, the right has come back in with their lovely, we want a carbon tax in return for no liability for climate change, all other instruments, regulation, mandates for renewables to be taken away. It's a pretty good deal, and that's actually supported by a few misguided NGO colleagues who have signed up to that. And if you want one that really irritated me was the European Association of Resource and Environmental Economists, ERE, just issued a joint letter in response, basically mirroring that, but without some of the liability stuff, saying the carbon tax is the best and most optimal solution for solving climate change, and that we should go forward. We can just redistribute it to everybody and they'll trust us. I used to be a member of the area when I was a proper economist, and it just made my heart sink to see that stuff still in the game. So both sides, there are both sides. There is basically a carbon price side that's now being identified with the right and the liberal in the European term, and then there's a leftish kind of investment-driven, jobs-driven programme. In the EU, the Green Party has got a Green New Deal, the SPD in Parliament, we will see as part of the European parliamentary negotiations some of those aspects coming through. Europe is investing 500 billion in economic stimulus up to 2020 through the European Investment Bank. 40% of that is going to green, most of the others going neutral. It's got a bit of fossil, but it's not bad. I mean, and they're going to renew that and maybe pump it up. So this kind of fiscal stimulus, jobs creating program, regional development is out there. We'll talk about how it's landing in different countries. And there are American foundations have paid, the Hewlett Foundation particularly, for AOC staff members to fly around Europe telling everybody about the Green New Deal, and to both the community campaigning part of it, which is one part, and the kind of economic policy part of it. So there's a concerted attempt to spread this movement globally, or particularly into Europe at the moment. So that's kind of factually where we are. But it's also interesting to think about the context of where we are at the moment, and just two factoids from this week, which are interesting. One, a conversation I had with a bunch of bankers in London who said, you do realise there are $12 trillion of investments currently earning negative interest, mainly off government gilts. So to be honest, the all-powerful financial system is not doing a brilliant job at making money off us, because it's paying governments to store its cash. Actually, mainly our cash, actually. Those people have pensions or corporates' cash. So that's... And the other one is that the UK just launched a Green Finance Institute this week on Tuesday in the Guildhall, 900 people stuffed into it. It's a co-sponsored institute by the City of London and the Treasury. And the person they've hired, Rhiannon Marie Thomas, to run it is a former Barclays banker, all sounding very conventional. She stood up and said that, I learned the financial markets were there to allocate capital efficiently. I don't believe that. This institute is about making the financial system allocate money to things we need for a sustainable world. And she got a rousing round of applause from 900 mainly financial sector people. And I sat there and went, gosh, narratives have changed since I was on that. But so things have moved on. Now, there are discussions, there are streams now in the financial elite that actually do get the fact that things need to change. One of the questions is whether they'll actually do what's needed to do it. But because there's plenty competing narratives out there. So what are the other narratives about what we should spend our money on? Because it's all about priorities. There's a very big narrative in the IMF and the World Bank system about the real problem in the world isn't the stuff we think is a problem, it's the infrastructure gap. To get growth up, we need to pump loads of infrastructure investment into developed and particularly emerging economies, 80%. We need to get productivity up because it's flatlined. And it's like quantity. We need more stuff. Who cares what it is? We've got to move more stuff out of the game. So it's very strong. You'll see McKinsey reports, Google McKinsey infrastructure gap. You will see that narrative beautifully displayed in waterfall diagrams, showing how much more money is needed to build this world out there. There's also a pretty large discussion about an economic recession coming. I mean, we've just hit one because of Brexit this quarter, as far as we understand. But because of the US-China trade war, China has just pushed a dirty stimulus. The Vice Premier of China said, turn off the pollution controls, we need to push money. And the Chinese state power conglomerates just came forward saying we need 300 gigawatts more coal in China to get going to deal with this American trade war that's taxing us to death. 300 gigawatts more in China, and actually, who's in the cockpit? Xi Jinping's in the cockpit. Let's be really clear about who's in the cockpit. Most of global emissions, and he's there for life. So, unless something very strange happens in China. So, cockpits as it used to be who's in the cockpit. Now we know at least one of the co-pilots is Xi Jinping. Certainly not white, but he definitely is male. We've also got a world where a lot of economies are starting to hit the change to the new economy. So South Africa is in a sovereign debt crisis because it invested too much in coal. And actually so is Indonesia. And actually so is India, where the central bank said we can't turn off the coal power stations even though they're more expensive to run than solar, because if we do, the local banks will go bust. And if you look at the China numbers, an awful lot of China is also in that place. So we've also created a bit of economic crisis with our success in getting renewables out the door. And we've also, because we haven't controlled climate, created it for lots of countries with climate impacts. So Mozambique has just been hit by 2 hurricanes it wasn't expecting, it can't afford to rebuild. It only got 10% of the money it asked for. But it did manage to borrow 2 billion on global markets against future gas revenues. That money's really left the country for it to come here to go into a bank account. So a lot of countries are struggling to keep up with just the impact of climate change, and they're not in a position to invest in the Green New Deal. So you talk to central bankers, they're like, we've got no QE left. If there is an economic recession, for all these multiple reasons, we're going to have to build real stuff. But how can we get our real stuff out there? If someone said to us tomorrow, get a couple of trillion into the global economy, just like 2008-9, they'll say, yeah, we'd love to build real green stuff, but we can't actually do it. So we'll do the old stuff instead. So actually, there's some real pressing need that Green New Deal, if we don't have a solution quite soon to use money to solve these problems, it'll be spent on the bad things, or just building non-resilient non-areas. So it's not just a theoretical debate, it's not just because AOC thinks about it. There's a real imperative to decide what to do if there is a big push for a global stimulus package, as there was in 2009-10 when we built the Green Investment Bank. And we will need that structures, those institutional public sector structures, to get stuff out the door. So that's just a comment. So it's not a theory, it's not theoretical, and it might be something we choose to do, it might be something pushed on us, or a dirty New Deal maybe pushed on us. What can we learn from other people who are discussing this? So those last 3 points, from lots of discussions we've been having, lots of people, different places. Context is king. So US politics does not equal UK politics, unsurprisingly. An awful lot of the US narrative is around race, because actually there's quite a strong correlation between vulnerability, exclusion and race in America. Those correlates do not appear as strongly in the UK. BME communities are more exposed to air pollution. But if you look who's damaged, who's a frontline climate community in this country, coastal communities, white, old, Brexit voting, hill farmers, white, old, car mechanics who are really losing their jobs because in London because they shift to electric taxis, white, working class, older, oil and gas workers. Actually, our side has really little empathy with the frontline communities. So sitting in rooms with left-wing activists, you say, well, what have you got to say to a hill farmer in Wales, or what have you got to say to a car mechanic in London who's lost their job? And they're not their people. So actually, there's a real tension with some of the narratives coming from the US that don't fit in our policies. We need to make sure we get the policies to fit our world, and it comes back to the, this issue about left or right and what we're doing with inequality. And one of the things which we're talking to a lot of people about is there is a bit of a green wave in Europe that's moving forward. That's not the time to say, we're on the political up, let's push over the opposition. It's about the time to open the big tent. This is where you try and get the 60-70% approval for what you're doing and bring people in. That involves our side to think differently, perhaps, about its political affiliation and how it works with different communities. So it's the first one. Design the politics around the country. Second, design in decent jobs. The real mistake they've made in the US is they've run it brilliant out of communities, and it's a little more designed than you think, and a little less spontaneous than you think, and there's some large foundations behind it, just like everything in the US. But they didn't involve the unions. So in California, the big American unions came out and protested against the Green New Deal because it was hurting oil and gas workers, because they hadn't brought the unions along with them. Now the unions are involved in most of the discussion here. They are involved in issues, but we've got a real problem with the green economy. We've got below minimum wage workers going out to offshore wind farms. Most of the new economy isn't unionised. The Labour Party has tried to get clean energy industry to unionise, they've refused. So we need decent jobs. There needs to be a decent jobs element of this. There's no point investing in a space where we're not bringing the decent jobs along. So that's really critical, and all of those issues we can talk about more. And the last one is names. New Deal is a very American concept. It works for people who like American politics, particularly in the UK, but it's quite left-wing in some ways. It doesn't work in Germany. They don't like deals. They talk about something different. It doesn't quite work in France, talking to my team there. It seems divisive, and in America it's very interesting. When they first polled the Green New Deal proposal, they got 70 to 80% support from Republican voters, against a context where environment and climate are the most divisive issues for American politics. If you look at every issue, gun control, abortion, Republicans and Democrats split most on environment and climate change than any other issue. But they managed to get 78% support. Then Fox News got going. Polling now, 6 months later, is they're down to 54, which isn't bad among registered Republicans, but that shows the battle of the other side is really pumping out the propaganda. This is communism, this is mad, this is about taking away your gun, your car. And now, remember, we've got the Oregon militia protecting state regulators in Oregon who are running away from the state to avoid being a vote on essentially an Oregon Green New Deal. So, we've got to stop there. So there's lots of pieces about making this quick for spaces. The Americans, this one is not perhaps going as well as we all hoped. And we also need to make sure the economics works. And one of the things, the last thing is, it's not just about pumping money in, it's also about reforming what we invest in. And I think we need to think about, this agenda. And I think that's also how you bring more political parties. And there's lots of things in this country, for example, that we're just investing in the wrong stuff. Who thinks that HS2 Heathrow and Hinckley are the best investments we can make with our infrastructure budget? But they take up a huge amount of it. You ask people, it's warm homes, more nature, resilient houses, clean air, but that's not what either party or the National Infrastructure Commission is putting the money into. So democratise it, decentralise this debate is as important as getting more money. And I think there's something in there, which we haven't worked out how to package or how to frame, which could be very powerful. But we also need to make up our mind and push it hard, because if the economic winds go the wrong way, we could end up, having thought so hard about it, being left behind again by the force of history.
Thank you very much, Nick. Well, we've certainly covered it's amazing how in the word Green New Deal, and green is obviously new and deal, I mean they're not, you wouldn't think you'd cover so much ground, but it is extraordinary how over a relatively short period of time, suddenly, this is, going all over the place. So I wonder where we've got a sort of the issue of finance and control of finance that Anne's put on the table, and the issue of how do the politics in the UK play out in this space, how can MPs, politicians get on board, and then how does it fit into the whole global context and the push in directions and a looming crash. So who would like to pick up? And there is a rule that if the first question comes from a woman, it all goes so much better. But no pressure on women. I don't know where that came. I don't know if there's brilliant. Okay.
I'll do my duty then.
Good, well done. Sorry, what did you say your name?
Yes, sorry, I'm Olivia Hanks. I work for Quakers in Britain, just for Road at Euston, and I was at the Mass Lobby of Parliament on Climate and Environment last Wednesday, where a lot of Quakers came along, and we were there just to support Quakers in talking to their MPs and to see how they get on, got some feedback from them. And one of the things that came up a lot in what people were telling us about their conversations with their MPs, and that this strikes a chord with stuff that we've experienced before as well, is that whatever question you ask, whenever you raise the issue of climate, with people, including people at very senior levels, but I think this seems to be true across sort of all levels of jobs, all levels of society, people immediately say things like, oh, well, I ride a bicycle. Oh, I've got solar panels on my house. And it's really striking how people retreat into that personal lifestyle kind of space in a way that I don't think they do with other issues in the same way. I feel like MPs probably, whatever they might think about it, would mostly accept things like inequality. They'll acknowledge it on some level as a structural issue. But when it comes to climate, there seems to be this huge barrier still to really understanding it as a structural issue. And so I just wondered, any thoughts, particularly from Rebecca, on how do we move people, and MPs in particular, beyond that?
Has anyone else talked to their MP, had any experience of talking to politicians about climate change and how they respond? Yes. Sorry, what's your name?
The Labour Shadow Minister for Transport, who's my neighbour, and she equally is just just something you can't penetrate, actually. So that's the Shadow Minister
for transport.
And I've tried, yes, I've tried.
So transport, minor thing in climate change terms.
Yeah, well, climate change, transport, anything to do with anything, and it's just this sort of. I think there's. Sorry, I'll answer something, which is I think in response to what you've noticed, people cannot hold on to what is really going on. So it just feels like that is a thing we really need to sink before anything, is people's incapacity to really sort of experience what might happen what a climate emergency might actually look like. It's not a slow process. It's something that could die very rapidly, and we might not be talking about policies or the Great Green New Deal. We will actually just be thinking and worrying about how we get food into our mouths, or how we're dealing with flooding or temperature rises. So I think, somebody who hasn't got a great capacity to talk about economics, but I think about it, and I don't know half the terminology we're using, I sort of come back and think this isn't about party politics. This is probably trying to get out a message and an idea of a new system to people, which is not to do with politics and politicians. So sorry, I'm answering a question.
But it's interesting, why do people freeze up? Anyone else talk to their MP?
Not about talking to MP, but I've had very interesting conversations with climate psychologists who would argue that, I can't remember the precise form, but the vast majority of us are soft deniers of the problem. And there's sort of the psychologist can sort of give some insight into why we do that. The problem is so scary, so absolutely overwhelming that we can't psychologically take it all in. So we switch off in order to get through our daily lives. And I think politicians do that, just like I think we as individuals do it. So I think there's something about needing to understand the psychology of the problem.
So how can we try maybe to get it into, because we can't, you have to deal with anything in small bits. As always said, if you're overwhelmed, start a list and try and work out something you can do. How can we make a list that's both effective and psychologically copable with, so we feel somehow empowered? Do you have any ideas?
Crack that one up.
It's the easy question.
Yeah, so I would really recommend people read the psychology stuff, because as you said, it's very powerful. The study that I find really interesting is there was a study of how climate scientists cope with working on climate change all the time, chucking out evidence that they don't feel is being answered, and then going home to their families. And that's, we will all experience that. And the more you can acknowledge that, the better. One of the strategies one of the implicit strategies that climate scientists have is what they call optimism bias, which is where they actually, go through, do their rigorous scientific stuff and then pick the outlier, this might be okay route, and focus on that. And that will affect the way that they talk. So the psychology stuff is really useful, but I also I find it, as more of a sort of sociologist, social theorist, if I have to badge myself, I find the problem is that that's talking about individual responses, and I find it much better to talk about societal responses. And there's a sociologist called Carrie Norgard who talks about social denial, and it's brilliant. Basically, the idea that we conspire with each other not to talk about it and to dampen it down. And I find that, it's true, but it's also more empowering than the psychological answer, because if we're conspiring with each other to dampen it down, we can also, as Extinction Rebellion proved beautifully, we can also conspire with each other to make it a thing that is on the streets. So, I think, to go back to the MP point, the behaviour change in lifestyle, I agree, it drives me nuts. It's not just MPs, it's media particularly, I think. I think that's the way to counter it, and I would say, if anyone, go and see your MP, please go and see your MP. There's an organisation called Hope for the Future who provides all the resources you might need about how to have a conversation with an MP, and I would make it a conversation. So the best way to get away from the lifestyle stuff is, just ask an MP what matters to you, and it floors them. And then if you start it as a values thing, my community, my family, whatever, you've got a route into that social question. And I would come back very strongly on the lifestyle stuff. And the MPs know about, they know it's structure, not lifestyle, don't they? It's just that if they're given an excuse to talk about something easy about light bulbs, they'll do it.
Kind of 3 reflections. One, We managed to talk about nuclear war for quite a long time. My first activism was CND, and we used to sit there going, thank God we live in an overlap of 2 blast zones from American bases. We will be killed early rather than being dragged out. That's a typical 15-year-old in the AC's conversation. But, we found a social conversation about global Armageddon. We had a culture about it. We find social ways of talking about things. I think Exile's been brilliant about that. You're going to go to one event in London Climate Action Week on the 8th, Roundhouse, Camden, Culture Declares. 400 cultural organisations in the UK, from small theatre groups to 150 museums to, I think Tate Modern's declared now, saying they're going to use their cultural spaces to give people, to help people engage with this on a different issue. It's a huge piece of machinery for social conversation. And us, the soaps are doing it, the films are doing it. There's actually a whole thing about environmental placement in films, and so there is that social conversation. We've done it before on existential issues, can do. But actually the leaders took more seriously than the population to start with. So actually what's missing, what people don't look for, they say, if it's so important, why aren't you acting like this? And I work with top level security people in government all the time, and the generals get it, and the intelligence people get it, but we're struggling to push it through to that kind of number one security issue, so that people think the leaders take it seriously. Some do, some don't. So people think, well, yeah, I do, but that's why Exile has got such a strong kind of anti-government, anti-establishment, slightly populist feeling, because they're not seeing the response, and then that's one of the dangers, because it can slip off into rather worse populism. But the simple thing for me, what can you do, and what we're going to do, what we've persuaded the NGOs to do, is money. That's back to money. What's the simple thing? If you want to show you're serious about an issue, spend your money on it. You've got budget spending review coming up. We want to see a massive swing of money away from new roads into solving the climate crisis. We've got a list of things you want, and adds up to around 2% of GDP. It's not huge. We spend 40% through the state. But even 1% of GDP would be a start. So that for me, and it's not, someone told me, we don't need that money, we can do it for the private sector. It's like, you don't get it. Of course we can do clever things with private money. That's not the point. This is a political symbol about being serious, and actually it helps get stuff done. But that means they can't get off the hook. They can't say we set a target, in 50 years we'll tell you if we've got it. So put the money on the table now, then I'll believe you're serious at scale. And I want that to be the fight for the next couple of years, because otherwise they can slip out the side and all these people, because they aren't serious, and they're not coming to Climate Week, and we're not seeing MPs turn up at any events and stuff like that. So we need to get very much clear at us they can't really enter. And that's our responsibility to make that work.
Would you like to?
I mean, all this thing about individual action is, I think, the fault of the Green Movement. The Green Movement has said, look, behavioural change and community change are the important things. They've never really talked about structural change. And what I like about the Green New Deal is that it talks about structural change. We have to structurally transform our economy in order to be able to save our ecosystem. And the Greens haven't talked about that. I mean, I think Greens have been wonderful. There's millions of green organisations all over the world, but they're very dispersed, they're very, disaggregated, and the Green New Deal is the first thing that provides a funnel, a channel, into which all the energy around climate breakdown, and I wish we'd stop talking about change, climate breakdown and Earth systems breakdown can be discussed. So I blame the Green Movement for that, and it's not surprising, but it's also, this is not a bottom-up process. We can't rely on individual MPs who are not, properly briefed, who don't have leadership, or if they do have leadership, the leadership's talking about building Heathrow and about HS2 and so on. That's not where the decisions are made. And the other thing I want to say is this, that the emphasis on carbon taxes, which has also been a very green issue, has invited a backlash, in my view, entirely legitimately. What the Gilets jaunes have done, have said, hang on guys, we've got a big problem, and as ever, as you did after the financial crisis, so you're doing again, you're passing the buck and making us pay the cost of this, to bear the biggest burden of it. And I think that's a really, really big mistake. The thing we need to remember, and that Kevin Anderson's going on about all the time, is that 10% of the population are responsible for 50% of toxic emissions. Why don't we deal with the 10%? Why do we go after rural workers in France who have to get from A to B in their little white vans because the French government doesn't provide alternative sustainable transport systems, right? So I just think that we, as the Green Movement, has got it wrong, and the consequence is this kind of impotence that we see all around us. And I just want to make one more point, which is that, and it's a story I like to tell about Ken Livingstone, because I was around when Ken was thinking about the congestion chart, and I knew all of his advisors, a bunch of lefties they all were, and they were all opposed to the congestion chart. Only Ken wanted to do it. And they all said, this is going to be politically disastrous, right? And on the day that he launched the congestion charge, Ken put 300 new buses on the roads of London, right? On the bus routes of London. So when people couldn't come in with their cars, they had other forms of transport. So the other thing about the Green New Deal is that we talk about front-loading the transformation before we start to clobber the users and say they've got to pay more taxes or whatever in order to pay for it.
Yeah.
So people were given alternative forms of transport when they were asked to pay more on their cars. And that's why there was no political backlash. But in France, there's no alternative, so there is a backlash. In Pennsylvania, these isolated, low-paid coal mining communities have been clobbered by the financial crisis. Now you come to take their jobs away, right? And their identities and all of that. And you're blaming them when actually they are not the architects of our financial system. They are not the architects of the 10% that spew out 60%, 50% of emissions, right? And they're not responsible for the 1% doing very, very, very well out of all of this, right? And so there is a backlash. And so we get Donald Trump, and we get Bolsonaro, and we get Mr. Duterte in the Philippines, and we get Erdogan in Turkey. These are the people saying, hang on, we've had to bear the burden of the crisis, the financial crisis. You politicians tell me that you can't do anything about this. I'm looking for a strong man, Mr. Putin or Mr. Xi, President Xi, who is going to protect me and my family from these market forces that you say are beyond our control and that governments can't do anything about. So, I just don't believe in blaming individuals or even politicians for a crisis that is actually big and global and that actually a very small part of the population are responsible for. And we don't talk about them. We talk about what I must do to change my lifestyle. And I think, well, I will change my lifestyle. Of course I do, and lots of people do. Henry cycles everywhere on a bicycle. He's heroic. So, but that's not enough. That's not enough. If somebody else can get on a plane and every weekend go to somewhere in, I don't know, the south of France or Turkey or the Caribbean for a holiday or for a night out with the boys, If that can happen, why the hell should we, do you see what I'm saying? And I think it's because we haven't looked at the structural side and we haven't identified the big culprits. Instead, we're asking ordinary people to take the brunt of this.
I'm going to go. There was you want.
Can I just say one more thing, Henry?
Right.
The New Deal is a very, very British invention.
Oh,
It's
yes.
John Maynard Keynes' invention. Roosevelt could do nothing. Roosevelt led very, very heavily on Keynes. He was governor of New York City in 1929 when 5,000 banks went down overnight. Right? The person that he turned to for dealing with Wall Street was Keynes. So it's a very British idea. I mean, the Germans may have a problem with it, fair enough, but you can't say that it's an American idea, it's a British idea.
And AOC got the idea from you as well, so there you go. Plus ça change. Okay, far away.
I'd be interested in what you thought of as a job guarantee, perhaps intersectional with the Green New Deal. I know some MMT thinkers have been thinking about that. And I've heard both left and right, and I can appreciate the suspicion on the left of sort of market mechanisms and your sort of criticism of the carbon tax and dividend or the escalating dividend. But I was interested to know why you don't think maybe a carbon tax and dividend could not work alongside a Green New Deal. I know I heard you sort of the phasing of that, but whether we could or should maybe do both. And that's the same with this question on the structural change and cultural change, because actually in a lot of your talks you talk about the cultural change as well as the structure. And I wonder why we couldn't do both. I don't know, maybe the emphasis on either have been wrong, and I sort of hear that, but it seems to me that you're actually talking about needing both. And then the last one about identity and freaks, and maybe just picking up on the kind of Quaker thing, because like a couple of 100 years ago, when actually UK was one of the first, when slavery was legal, the Quakers, who were the ones who were really petitioning, were considered freaks, but actually, depending on when you do it, within 20 years from their really fierce petitions, it was gone. And if you count slaves in terms of MPV, you would never do it. Highly useful economic resource, obviously morally not there. So I do wonder whether that, because that identity thing comes from a cultural or cultural structure, it's the same thing. So can they both work together? Talking about the big tent, because you could get some people off on the centre right if you say, okay, we do the infrastructure, job guarantee I'm interested in, can we do carbon tax and Green New Deal and just go all ahead because of that? Or are they actually mutually exclusive because of the politics of the matter? Same for free, same for things.
Okay, well I think we'll come back on that because there's quite a lot of different dimensions that we're going to cover. Who wants to start on that?
Can I just come back on the...
You could come back on.
This structural individual thing seems to be emerging, and I absolutely agree it is both, because, and while I totally take your point about that this is a structural issue, I completely buy that, no argument. But it is also an issue of culture and identity, and the two things are linked. So imagine if, right, I sort of spend train journeys imagining the most amazing sort of political intervention on climate, and one of them is, imagine if you could get like a whole group of people in that 10%, right, really wealthy people going, I'm so worried about climate, I'm not going to fly anymore, right? Imagine how much power that would have, and I think that that part of the job is making this more culturally mainstream, and it's almost like it's either end of the spectrum. I mean, I cycle. I don't know if I cycle as much as Henry, but I mean, no one cares. Like my identity is built around being like a middle class greenie. But when you see, if we could make it in the interests of the communities who have been left behind by the global economy, like imagine if you could make it something that the bottom 10% and some of the top 10% were really stood up for, was in their interest, was part of their identity, we'd be going somewhere then.
Yeah, but if we've just got to think about the Second World War. What happened was we weren't prepared for it. We did not prepare for it very deliberately. Churchill was marginalised because he warned of it. Come the war, we build this tremendous sense of solidarity in the community and identity. So it's a kind of consequence, really. But we had to structurally change the economy as well in order to fight the war. And people had to give up their fancy big, houses and hand them over to hospitals and had to change their diets and all of this. And in the process, there was a massive cultural change of people. Those who weren't killed were a lot happier, really, and came out a lot healthier. But I think the cultural thing is important. I just wanted to ask to mention the job guarantee. I'm opposed to the job guarantee. I think it sounds very much like cockpitism to me, if that's the right word that you were using. The idea that you're going to bureaucratically and administratively match every single person to a job, how you're going to do that without using what I think will be really authoritarian methods for managing the economy, bureaucratic methods. I find it very bizarre. So for me, it's full employment, and how that happens, it will have to be driven by the state. What was your third point? Job guarantee culture.
One was slavery-free.
And then the other one was about...
Can you do a carbon tax, or the idea often they say is start low, go higher to give time, as well as, say, investment in Green New Deal
so
and
for me, carbon taxes are regressive. We know that, right? So the fact is, that's not to say we shouldn't have them.
Okay.
And I certainly think we're never going to get this top 10% to voluntarily give up their flights. Sorry, but they just ain't going to do it. but we're going to regulate and tax them to do it. The problem is, it's really hard to do that because they can just go off and, they can fly to Dublin, or they can take the ferry to Dublin and fly from there to New York if they need to, right? Because we can't manage our own boundaries, really. We can't manage our financial boundaries. So there's a real problem in how we get to the 10%. But I'd like to tax them like crazy and make it really, really expensive to go to, Eastern Europe for a boys' weekend, before a wedding and that sort of stuff that people do. But those are ordinary people. It's the big businessmen that fly all the time. There's a small number. Kevin says there's only about, there's a small percentage of people that fly all the time. So I think carbon taxes can be used for that. But I'm really in favour of front-loading a change to the system to give people alternatives before you clobber them with a carbon tax. That's what I'm trying to do.
No one trusts a dividend. It's, in a sense, it's so tiny. What's he going to do? We've got coal, say UK, coal's coming off the system. We'll push gas off the system. It's cheaper to do offshore wind anyway, and onshore wind, we can just let them roll on energy efficiency. We can't tax energy efficiency into being. We can't tax new infrastructure through. It doesn't work on cars anyway. We've got more $250 just fuel duty raising tax on fuel anyway. We will probably end up doing something on meat someday down the line. But I think culture will probably eat it first. So it's a real problem. Carbon tax is kind of solution looking for a problem, basically. Every time we came to it in government, there was a way of doing it that was cheaper, less dead weight loss, less political damage, and that's why we never used them, really. There were a few theoretical taxes, but they were never at a threshold that made a difference. Because clever political economy meant I can find a cleverer way, I can pluck this goose with less hissing, in the classic sense. I don't want to make it a big demonstrable tax. Not 1 or 2% of GDP to go net zero. That's tiny compared to the rest of the tax base. So again, I think it's just economists have got obsessed because they learn how to use price as if they can drive the economy through price.
Yeah.
When economies don't drive through price, they drive through technology and investment and social values and all the other things. Economists learn the word economics. This is back, we've got very good evidence base about the wrong economics. And I think the fact is politicians haven't chose carbon tax as an instrument for a very, very good reason. Not because they didn't do, their advisors didn't do economics 101 and 102 or 103, but because it didn't turn out to be the best idea to get to where they needed to get to. And if you start low and go high, actually the economist's optimal tax is start high, go low on carbon tax.
Yeah.
You look at the proper economics, because you need to drive high tax at the beginning to drive the technology, and as technology gets cheaper, you can lower the tax. Well, we've done that bit, we subsidise the early bit, clean energy's cheap, done. Really, it's a marginal tool we use in a kind of keyhole surgery way, not in a whole economy way. Yes. And that's also what Adair Turner says, and what Nick Stern says, which absolutely flabbergasted me when they said that. That's it.
Okay. I'm going to go to the far end there.
So just a message of hope here, really. I'm glad you mentioned the second.
David G.
David G, yes. I used to, 20 years since Friends of the Earth, the European Environment Agency and stuff like that. A number of messages of hope. You mentioned the Second World War. I had it down here as 4 good examples of very big, very fast transitions that we learned from. Number 1, when America entered the war, within months, the whole of the car manufacturing, lorry manufacturing, bus manufacturing industry, via a meeting with 20 men and FDR, they switched within months to the war machine.
Yeah.
When the war ended, FDR asked the top scientists, how do we change all this science and technology, which has been going into war for 5 years, into civil society needs? He sat down, produced a book, far-sighted, the system bought it, and America investing enormous quantities of post-war science and development money into generating the new industries that we now benefit from. And read The State as Entrepreneur, which you know by Mazzacotti, where she tells you how the iPhone was built on that taxpayer money, funded research by the Ministry of Defense in the US and the NASA people.
Yeah.
And so you can shift very quickly. The other one example I got from that is Japan in 1973, totally dependent on oil. They had 2 pressures. Citizens were suing the government for respiratory ailments from fossil fuel burning because the chimneys were pouring out stuff all over the cities of Japan because of the post-war build-up of that economy. And millions of people were suffering. They started suing the government by hundreds of thousands, so the government was getting really in a corner. Then the oil crisis happened, and then they had no oil virtually, or the price of the oil went up. and Japan had no other sources except oil. They said, right, we're going to call a pollution crisis meeting of Parliament. They had a 3-month meeting of Parliament. They called it the Pollution Crisis Parliament. And they didn't do things in boxes like saying, is it carbon tax or is it regulation? Life is so multi-complex, you need all the bloody tools in the toolbox. So they said, right, all those people who live in this circle around all the big cities, all you have to do is live in that city, and if you get respiratory diseases, asthma, bronchitis and so on, you will count as being compensated. Where will the money come from? An SO2 tax. On all the shit that's coming out of all those millions of chimneys, we put an SO2 tax, not divided by economics as to what's the marginal damage to a flow in the lake. We'll just fix the price that would generate enough income to pay all the people who need compensation. And then what we'll do is also say to the industry, there's a Japanese invention that's been languishing in the universities for 20 years. It's called flue gas desulfurization, a fancy word for a fancy filter on a big fat chimney. And that hasn't had a marketplace. Well, we're now going to tell every chimney in Japan to put FGD on like by next year. That was an investment in the economy of between 3 and 4% of GDP. And it was beautiful because the economy was already collapsing because of the oil crisis, as all capitalist economies were, but particularly Japan, they were the most dependent on oil. So that expenditure on filters on chimneys helped to drag the economy out, generate income, and then what did they do? They sold FGD to Germany, America, Britain, because we all had acid rain problems caused by the same thing. So they picked up enormous export markets. All that was done within 3 months via parliamentary means, not dictatorship, debated in Parliament with people who could see hope. I mean, why the MPs slide away to personal stuff is that we haven't given them the hope.
Yeah.
We haven't given them the visions of what's possible. We've got really small-minded politicians. We haven't got FDRs, we haven't got Roosevelts, but out there in the Extinction Rebellion and elsewhere, we haven't got Keynes, but we have got potential. That was just on how you make big transitions. Go to business. Oh, right. The last point on big business. In 1992, there was a huge world conference on the environment and development. It was called Rio Conference. Big business, 2 years beforehand, couldn't spell either of those two words. So 36 CEOs of the biggest multinational companies in the world sat down, got a clever person like Nick to help them produce a big fat book which they put on the table in Rio, a business perspective on environment and development. And it was full of the Green New Deal, it was full of very radical things, including, of course, the carbon tax. You have to internalise the cost of climate change into fossil fuels for obvious reasons. But they said, we don't control the system, it's politicians. Politicians have to change the system and we'll change with you. That was progressive capital. That was like Wedgwood in 1833 when the first Factories Act was passed, the Effective Factory Act, to textiles in the north. Wedgwood in Staffordshire wrote to the government and said, I want a Factories Act because I'm the smartest capitalist around in potteries. And so progressive capital is always looking for chances to, get the market to reach their high standards and then they make more money that way. So there's plenty to do and we can do it, really, we can. And it's not doom and gloom at all, it's about opportunity, seeing a new way forward. We've had an industrial revolution since 1750, based on fossil fuels. A visiting Martian would say, why have you stuck with the stocks for 250 years and not gone with the flow? Because the flow is wind and solar, totally there, every day, just to pick up for nothing. Why can you stuck with the stocks? Because you've also given poor people asthma at the same time, etc.
That doesn't mean that everyone can speak for 10 minutes. Right.
Just to follow up on that, where are the leaders and why haven't you got leaders in this field?
Where are the leaders?
Well, two quick questions really. How can we make things happen fast enough? Scientists are telling us we've got 12 years to sort out climate problems. Is it all going to happen in 12 years? And the other thing is to go back to the regressive nature of taxes, carbon taxes. One reason the Second World War effort worked was because we had rationing, which people saw as fair.
Yeah.
Could we not ration air travel, for example?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we've got a call for hope, leadership, rationing. I mean, how, the emergency, the timing. Sorry, we're going to take one more.
Yeah, how's this all going to happen? That's some really great ideas and everything, but I mean, there's just mass cognitive dissonance about climate change. The wartime analogy I don't think works. That's not the way climate change is taking place. It may be that at some point it becomes a tipping point when everything gets out of hand, but maybe it'll be too late there anyway. The problem is that as far as I can see, when you have, just to bring it down to sort of very basic level, you have a Labour Party that can't even oppose Runway 3 at Heathrow, but then gets a bill passed, a motion passed in the House of Commons saying it's a climate change emergency. That's cognitive dissonance for you.
Yeah.
Right, we've got 5 minutes left, and I know we've got lots of hands, but I think maybe the last set of questions was all about how can this happen? How can this happen in a time, given the short time we've got to really take action, given the context of the sort of political, social situation that we're faced with, how can actually real action happen? So what I think I'll do is just give each of the 3 panellists a last chance to answer this very simple question that they should all have immediate answers to. And that will take us to 8:30, where we can still go on talking about it, and people will be around, and there's drinks and everything. So we won't finish the conversation, but we'll finish the formal a bit with this sort of last opportunity. So we'll go reverse order. Nick, you're ready with this one, and give the last word to Anne, and then we'll wind it up.
I'm having a stroke of optimism in the UK because I actually think we've got the strongest group of country we work in, to be honest, where most of the elite is actually signed up to this. Yes. And that's why I want to put a bold money ask on the table because it kind of crystallises it all into a very simple political moment. The government's just agreed to fiscally stress test all its fiscal spending against climate impact.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's some stuff going on. I mean, I'm not sure they really understand the implications. I love it when they agree stuff.
Yeah, but Mark Carney does. We're talking about 93 trillion here.
Okay, I know. And so I think there's enough ingredients on the table, enough support. The CBI came out saying net zero, let's go for it. I mean, it's quite mad in a way because I've been working so long. So actually, I think our main problem is organising. We've got to organise that voice into Parliament and actually argue really hard for Parliament to have more power. Because the things go wrong when they get stuck in the executive, where they get eaten by the Treasury and others. So the other thing, let's also organise, let's ask for money first, and let's put the Treasury on the spot, because let's face it, all of us worked in government, they are killing this. And it's not ministers, it's the top of the Treasury civil servant who keep on under. You know what I mean? And actually, as the XR, I want to know the next action, apart from against the fossil PRs in London, should be on the Treasury, because they're hiding behind everybody else. And they've got to tell us what their solution is to the climate emergency, because they're hiding behind the other departments, and we need to gently and lovingly bring them into the world which their government has signed up to. So, but get off your butt and go and do something. Go walk in the Treasury with a net zero petition.
20th of September is the Global Action Day. We should all be outside the Treasury. General strike.
Yeah, I mean, your question of how do we make this happen is absolutely to the nub of it. I would say we collectively, partly the climate movement, but actually loads of people who had never never gone vocal about climate change before, created enough momentum and political capital to declare that climate emergency. The last time we saw such high levels of interest was around the time of the Climate Change Act 10 years ago. We're seeing a similar spike, and the result is those things. So that kind of action does work. It helps, as Nick said, that there's now, was it 250,000 people in London whose jobs are in this. We've created the political mandate for those emergency declarations. We sure as hell, and I disagree with you on this, Nick, we sure as hell haven't yet created the political mandate for what we need to deliver on net zero. And I worry about, I do worry about wartime analogies just because they are wartime analogies. I think we really need to have a discussion about the public mandate. And I can't let it go, Nick, about whether President Xi is flying the plane.
He's in the cockpit.
He's in the cockpit, okay. Well, although Chinese people can't vote, whether or not they support the regime is really important, right? And since 1989, since Tiananmen Square, the rough deal has been you can have economic growth, but you don't have a vote, basically. That is the social contract in China. That's a gross simplification, and if anyone, but
we're not going to go there.
What I'm saying is that representation isn't just about being elected. Representation is about saying that what you do is in the interest of the people that you say that you lead. Right, so President Xi is in that space as much as other people are.
He's in the cockpit. You said it was white men. It's not white men. There is a Chinese person in the cockpit. I'm not saying...
Well, I'm saying there's no one in the cockpit, but... so whether it's in a democratic or a non-democratic country, it's about building that political space. So the optimism I want to leave you with is that I do think there is a public mandate. I saw it. One of the really interesting things about what's happening now is the greater interest in deliberation and actually having a serious grown-up democratic conversation. I helped Green Alliance run some very small deliberative processes with people, and actually regulation, not all this tax stuff, regulation was really popular. Right? People said, why are you building, what's all this, we showed them the frequent flyer levy, they're like, we don't want like a tax. If you're serious about curtailing flying, what are you doing building a third runway? Just don't build the runways, don't invest in the airports. If it's that serious, that's what you should do. So there's probably more of an appetite than you think for those kinds of measures, but I don't find the wartime analogies help to build that case. So where I would end is, David, I agree with 95% of what you said, except the business stuff. I actually think that we need to be much clearer than we ever were about which businesses are part of the problem. And,
I said just progressive business at the top end, the top 10% lead. They're the ones you focus on.
Yeah, but some of the businesses that have been very much welcomed into the progressive business space over the past 20 years are the ones who have used that in order to continue continue to pump out fossil fuels, basically. And I feel like I'm quite part of the pragmatic wing of the environment movement, should you say? But I've had enough of that. So I think that's part of the politics that we need to be much more clear about. Who is doing stuff which is unacceptable in climate terms and in social terms.
Thank you.
So, on what we should do, well, we should all join Extreme Rebellion, and I agree with Nick, we should mobilise around the Treasury. We did that in the Jubilee 2000 campaign. We formed a chain around the Treasury, we closed the doors, we didn't really have much impact, in fact, on them, but we persuaded the Treasury they had to write off the debts. And that was quite a tough ask. So I think, yes, demonstrations, and we have a slogan in Jubilee 2000, which is, the people must lead so that the leaders can follow. And really that's also what has to happen, and that's what's so exciting about what these school strikes are doing and what Extreme Rebellion is doing. On the question of leadership, I think our political leadership has been hollowed out. Who wants to be a parliamentarian? When I was young, it was a very prestigious thing to do, and it was also important and powerful. You're not powerful now if you're a politician. You don't make really important decisions about the allocation of resources. That's done by the market. The markets, we've privatised so much of our economy, the market decides on where money should go, not politicians. So if we get feeble politicians who have no leadership abilities, that's a consequence of the kind of politics we've created. And I think the question about urgency and how we start, I think we start with demonstration. And we start with the third point I wanted to make was this. I'll never forget, I was advising the churches on their green campaigning in 2005 in preparation for Copenhagen. And I had to meet all the NGOs, all the big NGOs, all the chief executives and so on. And I said, the thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to come together and you're going to have to agree on one thing that you're going to ask world leaders to do. And you're going to have to all get behind it, hard that might be, and go out and make that demand, that ask. And they said, no, we can't do that. We've got Friends of the Earth who've got to promote their brand, and Greenpeace got to promote their brand. We've got to raise money, blah, blah. And I'll never forget going to a demonstration in Trafalgar Square, which really dismayed me just before the Copenhagen summit. And there weren't many people, there was only about 20,000. And there was about 150 banners. And people had, well, this happened later as well, they had blue gloves on and they were doing this, basically. And they went to Copenhagen without a single ask that the whole of the civil society united behind. And so they were done over. And that's not surprising. We've got to decide what is the one thing we want our politicians to do very urgently and by when. Right? And we've got to make that demand. But we go around saying, oh, well, maybe you should change your, your recycling habits or whatever. We go around with a range of things. We've got to have what is the one big thing that's going to make a big difference that we demand our politicians do? And for me, it's probably the 10%. Make them pay.
It's Mark Carney saying 93 trillion must move by 2030.
The final thing I wanted to say is don't let anybody fool you that there is no money.
There's masses of money.
The global financial body that oversees the global economy, monitors it after the financial crisis, says there's $373 trillion of financial assets. The hedge funds, the shadow banking system has $185 trillion of financial assets. Pension funds sit on $40 trillion of financial assets, which, as Nick says, there's nowhere to go at the moment. Right? Yeah. And the global economy is only about $80 trillion. So there's these trillions of dollars out there with nowhere to go. Right. And we don't have an economic system right now. We have a crazy economic system which doesn't allow them to invest that money productively and also to earn a bit of a return so they can pay pensions in 30 years' time.
So why doesn't everybody here invent a project to get this money?
The point is we've got to have big projects.
Multiple, hundreds.
Demands.
Okay, there's obviously an ongoing conversation to be had, and I'd just like to end by thanking very much Anne, Becky and Nick for giving a huge, wide-ranging response to all sorts of questions, covering a huge territory, and I think ending up with some hope. Thank you very much. Do please, I'll present